Hi guys, it's Felicia here with FeliciasWorld.com, and it is a beautiful winter morning in Phoenix, and I wanted to show you today how to make a log cabin quilt with 7-inch blocks. I made one about a year and a half ago and I published the templates, but I have this urge to make a second one in a completely different color scheme, and so I thought I would walk you through that today. This is the first one that I made, and I'll show you up closes of it later, but this is the whole quilt, and it's yellow and white. I used about 60 different yellow fabrics for this one, and let's take a look at what I did. Okay, so here you're seeing a little bit more up close of the quilt, and this is a very, very scrappy project, and I think when I did a count, I used about 60, a little bit more maybe, different yellow fabrics in this quilt. Now you're just seeing a corner of it. But this is kind of an example of how I like to work scrappy. So my idea for this quilt is that it's a sunny, bright yellow. I didn't want the overall effect to be a buttercup yellow, which I would say has a little bit of white in it. Or certainly didn't want the overall effect to be mustardy or ochre-y. I really based this quilt on a memory that I had of being a child and on summer vacation in Denmark, where my grandfather lived, and sitting in his glass veranda, which was painted, in my memory, cadmium yellow. And I'm sitting there, it's a summer day, sun is shining into this yellow room with white trim, and I'm cracking open a soft-boiled egg and realizing that I'm pretty much sitting inside of the soft-boiled egg. So that's the effect that I was looking for when I was putting together this quilt. So if you look at the individual fabrics, there's even oranges in here. And then you have a little bit of these more ochre or mustardy yellows, but a lot of it is very bright and a little bit over into orange with some that are very light in between. And I think the overall effect when you look at it at a distance is pretty much what I was going for, but then it still has a lot of interest up close. Also, I will talk a little bit about sort of keeping your fabric stash and keeping what you love. This is a fabric I bought when I was 13 years old, and I had saved up my allowance. And I went into Oslo, because I grew up in Norway, and I bought this at a fabric store that only sold French Provençal fabrics. This was the 1980s, and that was all the rage. And I've been holding on to these fabrics that I bought that early, and it was so fun to put it into this project. I also go back and use some of my Liberty fabrics. I love my Liberties, for those of you who have seen other pieces of my work. And then I have also in this quilt put in this fabric right here, which is also a Liberty, but it's Liberty with license from Sanrio to make Hello Kitty. So this particular strip doesn't have Hello Kitty in it, but if you look over at the edges here, there's a couple of other blocks. And here you can see the little Hello Kitty faces. This isn't something you would notice far away at all, but I love these fabrics. I order them from a girl in Tokyo in small cuts, and it's so precious to cut them up and then showcase them in a quilt like this. So I want to show you now the steps that I went through in order to make this quilt. So this quilt is entirely paper pieced, and I like the paper piecing because it allows me to basically sew on a straight line. I don't have to worry about my quarter inch seam allowances, and then every block turns out perfect every time. These are the paper piece templates that I published after I made this quilt. And if you open the book has 48 templates, and there is an instruction page that also have a link to my tutorials page. And then you can see there's 48 of these templates that are numbered. So I'm going to show you how exactly I went about making these blocks based on these templates. Okay, so I am not usually somebody who makes what I call line quilts, where I'm sort of sticking with fabric from one designer or from one collection by that designer. But I'm going to make an exception because I've been collecting French General fabrics for, oh my gosh, like since they came out, I think, almost. And I always find them to be so beautiful and irresistible in the store, and then I come home and then I don't use them. And so I have this pretty sizable collection of French General laying around. And so I decided I was going to make a, then rather pretty and controlled red, if we can call this red, kind of old red, and beige white log cabin quilt. And most of these prints here are from, I think, called a collection called Petite Prints or something like that. And there was a lot of blues also in that collection that I weeded out, and then I added in a bunch of older prints. I'm not 100% sure. This might be like Mimic and Simpson or something, some of these, but they kind of go with that color scheme. And then these are some lighter fabrics, and I don't have as many light ones as I have dark ones, but that doesn't bother me. That will be just fine. And I like to work in 2 color groupings when I make log cabin quilts, but you don't have to do that. You can certainly just work with, a much larger variation in color. I wanted this quilt to kind of be kind of tight in the color range and very controlled. I kind of, that to me is something I never really do. And so it seemed like actually kind of an interesting proposition for once instead of go completely crazy. So the first thing that you're going to do when you've selected your colors, by the way, it's very hard to give specific fabric requirements for these quilts because they are scrappy. And I think what I'm generally finding is that when I'm making blocks that are on the diagonal, like the model was, where half of the quilt is, or half of the block is in one color, and the other half of the block is another color, is that I get about 15 to 18 blocks to the yard on this half side. Okay, so what that means is, I guess, is that a yard of fabric, it sounds kind of wrong, would give you about maybe 8 to 10 blocks, but that sounds like a lot of fabric. You are wasting quite a bit because it is paper piecing, and so you tend to have larger seam allowances. And because we have narrow bars, there's a lot of seam allowances in a block like this, right? So every single bar is going to lose half an inch at least on each side. So that could be why. But either way, it's a quilt that uses a fair amount of fabric. So I guess that's the take-home message. And so when I start cutting fabric, I don't cut up all of my fabric at once. I will cut maybe 2 or 3 strips of each color, especially when I'm using a lot of different colors, and then I'll cut more as I go, and that way I don't end up cutting up all of my yardage. So in this case, I have maybe 15 or 20 fabrics here, and these are all half-yard cuts, and that's going to be plenty. I know that's going to be plenty for a pretty large quilt. And here, these I just happen to have bigger cuts of, so I'm not at all worried about running out of fabric. Okay, so I've selected my fabric, and you're actually going to see the instructions in here. It's going to tell you that you're going to cut your strips and your center blocks to these sizes. So the center block for your log cabin, so right here, you're going to cut those at 1 3/4 inch squares. And then you're going to cut your strips 1 1/4 inch. And so the bars here are only about ½ an inch wide. But if you start cutting your fabric at exactly 1 inch, which would give you technically a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side, it's actually a little uncomfortable to work with. You're putting the fabric down without really seeing exactly where it's going to go. Don't freak out, I'll show you how this works. But it's a little bit more comfortable to have an extra 1/4 inch to sort of wiggle your way around when you're sewing these quilts. And also, it doesn't have to be exactly 1 1/4, so sometimes my strips will end up being a little wider, a little narrower, especially if I have a remnant that I want to squeeze as much out of. Maybe I'll make my strips a little bit narrower just to get an extra strip squeezed out of that piece of fabric. So you can be a little bit flexible. So you can see my strips here. I just cut a few of each color. This is just some of the ones that I cut. And I've already made one block, which is here, and I think it's really pretty. I chose to have a brown fabric in the middle that I didn't show you earlier. And then on the back side here, you can see you end up with a lot of threads. And if I was a really, proper quilter, who was very concerned about the rules, I guess I would cut these off, but yeah, I haven't gotten that far. So you can see all the seams here on the back, and you can see I've left the paper in, and then on the back side here, you can also see that there is a dashed line out here. So after now that I've completed my block, if I wanted to, I could go back and I could cut this block down to the dashed line. That space between the last solid line and the dashed line, that is your 1/4 inch seam allowance for when you're assembling your blocks. So after a block is made on your when you're building your blocks, you actually trim them down on this dashed line. And when you piece your blocks together to assemble your whole quilt top, then you're sewing on the outermost solid line. So that's what those lines are for. Here is my sewing station for paper piecing, and I know I've shown this before, but I want to show it again because having a good setup for paper piecing is so important, and it's really simple. So I'm gonna come around and kind of show you what I have going on here. I'm sewing today on a Janome Memory Craft 9400 QCP, which was developed for quilters. I really enjoy this machine. It has a large underarm space, and it's really, really great for piecing. But if you don't have, you know, a $7,000 or $8,000 machine to sew on, I don't want you to not quilt. So in order to make a beautiful quilt, you really just need a straight stitch. And so if you have a $200 or $100 sewing machine that you bought at Michael's or Joann's or wherever, that's perfectly fine. You can probably get really good results with paper piecing. All you need is to have a straight stitch that will regulate length so that you can make it nice and short and that you have decent thread tension, and you're all set. But let me show you what I got going on here. So I'm a left-handed person, so I put my ironing station on the left side of my sewing machine, and I scoot my sewing machine over so that the needle is right in front of where I'm sitting. Actually, it's a little bit to the side of where I'm sitting. You don't need to have the sewing machine absolutely right in front of you. So think more like the needle position should be in front of you, and that gives me space for my little ironing surface, which is pretty dirty looking because I spill on it and use it every day. I end up changing covers on these but every 6 months or so with duck cloth, but you mean as soon as my iron leaks or heaven forbid I knock over a coffee cup, that happens, you know, it's all dirty. I have a block here that I was working on the other day, but we're going to start a new one today. I have a straight pin with a flat head. The flat head is kind of important, but you only need one of them. And then I have a little travel iron. Now you can use a normal iron, but I bought this one, I think at Bed Bath & Beyond. It wasn't terribly expensive, maybe about 30 bucks. And I love this little Rowenta travel iron. It folds down so you can take it with you to quilting classes. And I use it dry. You always want a dry iron for paper piecing because the moisture could actually make your paper warp or shrink, and you don't want that. And I'm using it at high heat. I tend to burn out of my irons every 5 or 6 months, so I've given up on buying expensive irons. And then I have a pair of short-bladed scissors. These are my Fiskars that I really, really love for this, and I'm going to show you why these are so good for this particular work. A seam ripper, I'm sorry to tell you, you're probably going to want that. And then on the other side, I happen to have a drawer section here. So my drawer section, I actually pull out the drawer. It usually has scissors and stuff in it, but I put my fabric here, and then I have more fabric here, and so that it's within easy reach. And this means that I can assemble several blocks in a row without actually getting off my butt, which you could argue if that's a good thing or not, but that's how I like to work. Okay, so I think we're ready to start. I think my iron has heated up. I keep my pin usually just kind of tacked into the ironing surface fabric. And I'm going to take one of my templates out of my book so we can take a look at that. And I'm going to find myself one of my little centerpieces and some fabric strips. Okay, so ready to start. So we're not actually sewing on this side of the fabric, or we are sewing on this side of the fabric, but the fabric does not go. Okay, let me start that over. We are sewing on this side of the paper, but the fabric is not going on this side of the paper. The fabric goes on the back. And if you're holding these templates up to the light, you can actually very clearly see the black lines through the paper, but I can even see it here. So I don't know if you can see it on camera, but I'm gonna place my center fabric, kind of center it over where this innermost square is that says number 1. And it doesn't have to be 100% on the center, just kind of sort of so that you have some seam allowances going all the way around. We're not very concerned about 1/4 inches there. And then I take my fabric, hold on, I think I have a selvage here. Always cut the selvage off, obviously. I'm gonna put this down, and I cut my fabric to length as I work so that I don't pre-cut my strips at all. And I basically just lay them like that. I take my little flat-headed pin, and I pin through the paper and the fabric. And if I look on the back side, I can kind of see, it might be hard to see this on camera, but I can kind of see that I have this innermost square well covered with seam allowances all the way around. The sewing machine, you're going to set to a very short straight stitch. You don't want it so short that your paper perforates completely and falls apart while you're sewing. On the Janome, I like to use a 1.5 stitch length. And as for thread color, you're actually kind of flexible because the stitches are so short that that the thread tends not to show up at all unless there's extremely high contrast. Like I wouldn't use maybe white thread on black fabric. I've actually done that, and I'll show you that in a separate video. But I'm not horribly concerned about super matching. So in this case, I have like a light beige that will be fine with the red on top, and then I had some leftover white in the bottom, and I think that will be just fine in this quilt. So I've set my stitch length to be very short. I'm using an open-toed foot so that I can see, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew this line between 1 and 2, and so the fabric here is covering that line between 1 and 2 on the back side. I can see that through there, so I'm going to lay that down. And I'm going to sew on that line. I'm going to lower my pressure foot, and I'm starting, as you can see here, I'm starting before the line starts. So I'm going to sew at least a 1/4 inch starting in the 3 box and ending up in the 5 box below and above. And the reason I'm using a flathead pin is so that it doesn't get stuck underneath the foot and cause my stitches to distort. I'm going to go kind of slow today so that you can follow along. But when you get these quilts under your belt and this kind of workflow under your belt, this will be a very, very quick, well, the quilts aren't quick because there's a lot of seams, but it won't be as tedious as it might look now that we're actually teaching. Now, if you look at what I did, I don't have a perfect seam allowance. I didn't even have my pieces technically like perfectly straight, and that's completely okay. It's not going to affect your project. A little bit of the brown here is sticking out on the back side. In this case, I'm probably not going to be concerned about it. I don't think it's going to show. But if I was concerned about it showing, I would basically take my scissors, and this is why I'm happy with these short bladed Fiskars, and basically cut down the seam allowance there a little bit. And now I'm going to take the iron. I'm going to press this seam allowance open. And then I'm going to do now the 3 windows. I'm going to put this down, take one of my white strips of fabric or light strips of fabric, lay it down like this, cut it to length, and touch it within the pin. And notice how I'm putting the pin all the way down on this end. The needle is going to end up here on the sewing machine roughly, and so I just want to make sure that the pin is out of the way. And I'm going to sew line 3. In this case, I'm making a red and a white quilt, and I want to have more white, can we call this white? More of the light or white than I have, I want to have more red than white in the quilt. And so the first 2 bars of every round is technically a little shorter to put together than the next bars, right? So if you look at the outermost circuit on a log cabin, 25 here will be the longest log, and I want that to be red. So that's why I'm starting with the light colors and then continuing on with red. So it's going to go white, you know, red, white, red, and technically I guess a little bit more than 50% of the block will then actually be red as opposed to white. So we got 2 bars down. Okay, now I'm going to switch to red. I picked this one, just putting it down. See, it's not a horribly nitpicky or finicky way of sewing. So once you stop being afraid and feeling anxious about it being wrong, you will probably find this to be a very relaxing technique. So this is the kind of quilting that I do when I want to listen to audiobooks on the side and not have to concentrate too much on what I'm doing. So it kind of flows. All the fabric has been cut. You got an ironing station right there, so there's no reason to get up. And I have my camera tripod smack in my workspace, which is why I'm probably a little clumsier than usual. And also you will at some point start to kind of automatically kind of know where your fabric is going to go in order to have roughly the right amount of seam allowance on each side. So there's no, like, I don't typically double check every seam at this point. When you're sewing and doing paper piecing, you also want to make sure that your stitches aren't so short that it's impossible to undo them. So you should be able to rip once at least without having any problems. I'm not going to take this whole strip out, but I just want to show you that if I needed to, I could rip. Okay, so it's not as unforgiving as some people tend to think that paper piecing can be. So we have the first round down. We're going to start number 2, which means I get to pick a new fabric. And I'm so lazy that I don't even iron my fabric ahead of time. I just cut it and I just iron as I'm working. So when I'm working at my natural speed, I can get 3 to 4 blocks done per hour. And usually what I do is this is like massively audiobook time. So I can make it through all kinds of exciting literature. So recently I made it through all the entire, see here I made it through the entire Sebastian Sincere series on Audible, which is amazing. If you like Regency period mystery. So let's see here. I'm gonna cut that red, and that's just because I'm a little worried about it showing up. You don't have to go all the way down. I just don't want that red sticking up on the back of the white. So I just cut it off. A lot of paper piecing teachers will teach you how to use a quarter, like add a quarter or add an 8 ruler for this kind of work. And you can, but I just feel like you are now adding another step to your quilting, because now you have to get up, or you have to have a cutting station right next to you and do all these extra cuts that involves a rotary cutter. And for me, it just ends up being faster to just sit there with a pair of little scissors. And I made these blocks every conceivable size, from 2.5 inches to 10. And the scissors work out just fine. And you cannot tell on the final product that the seam allowances on the back side aren't completely straight. Okay, so in this case, again, I'm just going to cut away the red. Okay, now we're back to a red circuit. I'm going to use this one, a little darker, brighter red. So I'm going to put that down. Cut. And then if the threads here become irritating, then just cut them off. You know, typically what I will do is, once I'm done with a sort of collection of blocks, I'll sit down, trim the back, and trim all the blocks down. So I don't think I need to cut anything there. And then I'm just gonna press that up. So you can see here the block is starting to, this is the last bar on the second circuit. It's the last piece I'm gonna sew on the video here too. And then we'll go back to what we do with the finished block. Okay, so we've made 2 full circuits, and notice that all I've been doing is sewing on the lines. Here I missed a line by, I don't know, a 1/16 of an inch or 32nd of an inch. I don't worry about that. I think in the big picture that's not going to show up, and you know, I'm perfectly fine. So once you've kept working your circuits until you get all the way out, the last circuit that you're going to sew on are going to have seams between, hold on, where's the right place to start? Between 18 and 22, between 19 and 23, between 20 and 24, and between 21 and 25. So those pieces of fabric will cover these outermost bars, 22, 23, 24, and 25. That fabric needs, when you're ironing and pressing it out, it needs to cover out to the stippled line so that you have fabric going all the way out to the 1/4 inch, at least for the most part. So when you're doing that last round, make sure that the seam allowance that you're leaving on the inside is not so big that you don't have enough fabric to cover past, you know, a little bit past this line here, the outermost line. I'm going to take you back over to the table and show you how we trim down these blocks when they're done. Okay, so here's the front side of the block that I just had made before the video. Here's the back side. So at this point, imagine that you have maybe made 8 or 10 or 16 blocks or whatever, depending on how impatient you are. Take your scissors and just cut off the loose threads on the back, and you can imagine that I've done that. And I just want to go back here and make sure that you guys can really see this, that when I'm sewing my seams, like here was the centerpiece, here's where the first piece is on the other side. I am sewing from before the line starts on the paper and past the line. It doesn't have to be exact here, but every line has to be, when you sew, it has to go past the start and end points. Otherwise, when you're sewing the cross seam, you technically might end up with a little hole there that could rip. So, so just sew past the beginning and end. Okay. So now at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim my block down. And I use my rotary cutter. I am not terribly concerned about dulling my blade. Some people might be concerned about that. You should switch your rotary blade out pretty often anyways. Otherwise, you're going to start wearing out your shoulders from all the cutting, especially if you do a lot of quilting. So I'm cutting on the stipple line so that I end up with my seam allowance only. Okay. So next part here is pretty important. So you don't take the paper out yet. You will eventually take the paper out, but not until your entire quilt top is assembled. And the reason I recommend that is that when you're putting your blocks, sewing your blocks together to form a quilt top, or to form your rows and then your quilt top, basically what you're going to do is that you put them the right side to right side and you line this up. You will have really, really nice firm 1/4 inch seam allowance, just because the paper is really stiff and kind of holding this whole thing together. And so when you start piecing your blocks together, you're sewing from the beginning of the paper down on the line, out past the end of the paper, sewing on the paper, and you can butt things up because you do have this nice edge that is a 1/4 edge, but you don't need to use a 1/4 edge foot. You can just stay with your open-toed foot when you're piecing your quilt together. As you're piecing together a big quilt, this gets kind of stiff with all this paper. You can imagine if you have a quilt that's, a queen-size quilt and you have all this stiff paper, it gets big and a little bit cumbersome. I would move it over to the kitchen table at that point so I have a lot of space for my quilt. But it just makes the piecing super, super accurate when you're putting together your quilt top. And only then do I go back. This is the day after. This is not something I do after I've just cleaned my house, but I go back and I rip the paper out, and you can see how the paper rips really easily. And again, it does make a mess, but you have a very accurately pieced up. So I hope you have fun with this. go ahead and make your own log cabin quilts. Make yourself maybe some pillows with 4 blocks or 9 blocks if you want to make a really big one. And I hope you enjoy. Thank you. I'll see you next time. Have a great day.